Welcome back to Overhead Athletics. Today we're going to talk about front leg bracing mechanics in pitching and throwing. This is a topic that comes up in discussion consistently. I consistently get questions on it, so I wanted to do a quick video on it. A lot of times we get athletes and coaches and parents talking about enhancing front leg blocking or front leg bracing mechanics. We need to understand how that occurs in the throwing athlete if we are to improve it. A lot of times when these athletes come in, their front leg looks fine. Sometimes they have a hamstring inflexibility that doesn't allow them to get their chest forward, because remember, the hamstrings attach below the knee and attach above the hip. And because of that, because of those attachments, they can be inflexible and tight, leading to you not getting your chest forward in the throw and your front leg having to bend just because the hamstring can't give up any more length. Remember, there's really three types of muscle contraction. We could break it down to a few more, really. But concentric being C-O and C-centric being shortening. The muscle is shortening and contracting. Eccentric being the muscle is lengthening and contracting. And then isometric being that the muscle is staying the same length. Muscles throughout the body are going to be doing different things depending on the movement and depending on the loads. Certain times, certain muscles are going to be lengthening while they're contracting or building tension, and certain muscles are going to be shortening while they're contracting or building tension. Keep that in mind as we go through a little bit of this. We have two throwers, for all intents and purposes, are identical in this image. Remember that front leg brace, like you can see in the video on the screen, is when that athlete's leg is extending or bracing for impact as they go through the follow through of their throw. What does that do for us, and why does that allow us to throw faster potentially? Because it's a redirection of kinetic energy. So what happens is kinetic energy, let's say in this thrower here, is moving towards the target. What we want is kinetic energy to move through the arm and to the ball, and by landing you redirect kinetic energy or change the direction of kinetic energy up the kinetic chain. So the front leg, being sturdy and firm, can change or redirect kinetic energy. It doesn't produce force. It does not increase kinetic energy or increase power. What it does is redirect that into a better direction so that we can utilize it when we throw the ball to maximize our speed. So like we said, for all intents and purposes, these two things are the same. The triangle being the pelvis, the top bone here being the femur bone, the upper leg, and then the knee is the two lines, and then the lower leg and foot down here at the bottom. Few things to consider when we do this, when we look at this, is the position that the leg lands in is going to be extremely important as for how the leg braces. When we land, what you hear all the time and what you're told by your coaches is often that you need to extend or straighten this front leg back. You need to straighten your front knee. You need to brace effectively. Okay, well, let's break that down, because that's not exactly how this works. Really, the front leg bracing is a byproduct of doing other things properly in the throw. What are those things? And remember, for all intents and purposes, these two things are identical here. My drawing is not perfect, and also remember that this is the floor. These two men are braced to the floor. Although it looks like they're floating, their foot is on the ground. Their cleat is on the ground here. And so because their cleat is on the ground, that means their foot isn't going to move. The coefficient of friction is too high. There's too much traction between their foot and the floor, or their cleat and the ground. So the front leg is braced. We're often told that the hamstring muscle, which attaches from the pelvis above the hip, below the knee and behind the knee, we're told that the hamstring bends or flexes the knee, and we're sometimes also told that it extends the hip. And so really what we think is that it resists hip flexion, so it resists our body going forward, but it doesn't, in closed kinetic chain, do so much to flex the knee. In fact, what it does in closed kinetic chain, meaning when the foot is on the floor and the foot is braced to the floor, it actually helps to extend the knee. And some of you guys are going to say, oh, I've taken undergraduate biomechanics or I've taken undergraduate anatomy, and I know that the hamstring bends the knee. It does certainly bend the knee when the foot is in the air. There's no doubt. I don't disagree. When the foot is in the air, the hamstring bends the knee. But here, let's look at what happens in closed kinetic chain when we're dealing with momentum. And so we're told to extend this front leg, but what that does is that disrupts what we're going to talk about here in a second, which is the synergy or the co-contraction of certain muscles. Muscles have to contract simultaneously and in conjunction with another to elicit the movements and produce the movements that we want to do if we're going to fine tune them. Remember that hamstring below the knee to the pelvis. Attaches on the back. Now, all a muscle does is pull on its attachment sites. That's it. It can't do anything else. It can only pull on its attachment sites. Now, if this hamstring muscle here pulls on this attachment site, it's going to pull that way. And if this one pulls on this attachment site, it's going to pull that way. Same thing up here. This one's going to pull this way, and this one's going to pull that way. Because of that, we can look at what these two muscles do. So we have a lot of, in the throw, forward momentum, right? The chest is moving towards the target. You're starting to get your chest forward in the throw. So we have all this momentum of the upper body going forward in the intended direction of the target. But the foot hits the floor and the foot stops. So what happens? This functions just like a trebuchet. Boom, the foot hits, just like the piece of the trebuchet hits the other part, and it flings the object further. Well, that can, bracing, if you've done properly, where you support the front leg, can allow you to accelerate the upper body forward faster. And this is basically how we stiffen and brace that front leg. So the hamstring does not flex the knee in throwing. It might when you lift your leg for your leg lift, but when you put your foot to the floor, meaning your front leg mechanics, it extends your knee. How does it do that? Well, there's a lot of mass and momentum that you're not going to overcome going forward this way, meaning your pelvis is no longer straight up and down, but now your pelvis is actually tilting forward. So this hamstring is eccentrically lengthening. Because the hamstring is eccentrically lengthening, it's pulling on the pelvis to slow the pelvis down this way. But if you notice, where does it also attach? It attaches behind the knee. And the foot is anchored to the floor, so the foot's not going to kick up this way. I've never seen anybody's foot come off the floor and kick up because the hamstring is contracting. If someone lifted their foot off the floor, the hamstring may pull their heel to their butt. But when the foot is on the ground, the hamstring does not pull to the butt. What it does is it pulls back on the knee. So it pulls the knee posteriorly. It extends the knee. Now, can it do this job alone? Certainly not. Can't do it alone. It has to work with this muscle that doesn't go above the hip, but attaches onto the femur and attaches on the front here. So normally, what would you say the quad does? It extends the knee by what? It extends the knee by kicking the lower leg out and up. But remember, the foot's on the ground. It can't do that. It's therefore stabilized against the surface because there's friction between your foot and the floor or in the ground. There's too much friction there and it's not coming up. So instead of kicking the tibia forward and up to extend the knee, it pulls the upper leg forward. So it extends the knee by pulling the femur forward, just like it would do in a squat or a deadlift. Pulls the femur up and forward, just like the squat and the deadlift, to extend the knee. In conjunction with that, the hamstring pulls on the back of the knee and pulls the knee backwards a little bit, which extends the knee this way. So we've got a force pulling on the top bone that way and the bottom bone this way. That's going to cause a relative extension here at the knee. And that hamstring has to be working hard to slow this pelvic tilt from this position as it rotates forward, as my chest gets forward in the throw. So what happens if I do this wrong? So what happens if I overly contract this quadricep because that's what I've been told to do? I've been told and coached to extend your front leg. What ends up happening is the quad extends this knee really hard. We have a phenomenon called reciprocal inhibition. Reciprocal inhibition comes about generally when we consciously and actively contract a muscle. So when we consciously and actively contract the bicep, the tricep is going to turn off somewhat. It's going to be inhibited. It's not going to work as hard. That's reciprocal inhibition. When we concentrically really contract this quadricep hard here to extend that knee back, what we do is we turn off this hamstring on this side a little bit. And because we've not used that hamstring properly, or maybe we've lengthened it too fast because we've extended the knee too hard, the hamstring can't do its job. Meaning the hamstring can't stabilize the pelvis. And when the hamstring can't stabilize the pelvis, we see a whole array of different inefficiencies. Because remember that pelvis, and when we talk about pelvic muscles, we're not talking about the deep pelvic floor, as sometimes we are. However, what we're talking about, or what I'm talking about, is all of these nice abdominal and oblique muscles that run from our rib cage down to our pelvis. And that includes your latissimus dorsi, which is really important if you look at your EMG profiles for accelerating the arm in the throw. We talk about rectus abdominis, obliques, internal, external. We talk about even the transverse abdominis. We talk about all of the erector spinae muscles that surround this core circumferentially. And those muscles aren't in this good position, this length tension position where they can contract well. When the pelvis tilts, let's say this is sideways, and the pelvis tilts from here to there, but everything else stays the same, now you've got shortened obliques and shortened muscles on one side and excessively lengthened muscles on the other side. Same thing if the pelvis tilts forward. If the pelvis tilts forward too far, you get lengthening of all of your core muscles to an extent they can no longer control. So the hamstring is essential in stabilizing the pelvis so that we can keep our core muscles in proper alignment, in proper length tension relationships where they can work to their most efficient level. What does this mean? This means we should probably stop telling our athletes to forcefully extend their front leg. And we should start thinking about how, if they're not extending their front leg, it may be not a power deficit. I mean, we've seen that time to time. Sometimes it's an inflexibility deficit where this hamstring is either weak or inflexible to the point where it can't eccentrically lengthen, where it can't contract as it lengthens to allow the chest to get forward and the front knee to get extended. That's usually the issue that we see from a physical limitation perspective. We also see sequencing errors such as landing in too much knee flexion, which will result in you being too much in an upright position or not flexed forward far enough, and the force traveling anteriorly through the knee, flexing that knee even further in the deceleration while not getting the chest forward. That's an error we see all the time, as well as arm action errors that don't follow the pathway of gravity or utilize gravity to the fullest extent that result in that front knee flexing too much as we go forward. If you guys like a program that's gone through all this, broken it down step by step, and taken athletes through a throwing progression over 12 weeks, check out our phase-specific throwing program at overheadathletics.com. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you guys in the next video.